Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening in different parts of the world that are joining this online parallel event on CSW 69. It's a very big pleasure for us to be able to be here with all of you today, discussing which we believe is one of the most important issues right now facing the situation of women and non-binary people all over the world. I'm very happy to be sharing this space with this marvelous panelist. We have a very extent and profound content to share with you today. So I'm just gonna go ahead and start so we don't miss any time in this introduction. Just make sure that all of you have your microphones off during the call, and then when you speak, just turn on your microphone. You are allowed to share your slides. And people in the room, we are gonna have an opening question and answer session at the end of the presentations. So please be sure to save your questions and opinions because we want this to be also an open dialogue. So first of all, I'm gonna start with the founding director of Medicineras, Aura Roch, who's right here with me in the room. She is going to present why drug policy is a feminist issue. That is this movement that with all the organizations gathered here, we are trying to put in the agenda worldwide. Aura, please, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you so much, Sylvie, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you here today. I'm gonna share my slides. Give me a sec. Okay, can you see it now? I guess you can.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Then yeah, when we are talking about the war on drugs, normally, let me check because I don't know what is not changing. This, go.
Yeah, it's changing.
Oh, okay, now. Okay, when we are talking about the war on drugs and when the states began the war on drugs, we know that it is not a neutral war. It's not against the substances, it's against the people who use drugs. And it was clear from the beginning, no? We know how it began against the Chinese population, talking about the opium wars, or how it followed, no, with the prohibition of alcohol, that we know that was the most dangerous time to use alcohol, against the cannabis that was used during the 50s, against the cannabis that was used by the Mexican population, or we can go to the 60s, no, with all the psychedelics and how they were also connected with people fighting against the war in Vietnam, for pacifism, for ecologism, for feminism, anti-racism, etc., etc., etc. No? Also, we can go, another chapter of this war on drugs was in the 80s, again, the Black women using crack, no, and all the propaganda that was done against these women that thinking that all these kids will be crazy 20 years ago, and we know that it never happened, no? Then all these campaigns that were not about drugs, were about this population that wanted to be controlled, and how the war on drugs was an excuse to control borders, to control people, to control things, no, all the merchandising, etc. No, then how the war on drugs has been an excuse for that. But what happened when we are talking about the war on drugs from a feminist perspective? We know that the war on drugs with women began really earlier. We know how the women were using plants as a remedy or as a poison to take care of their communities, no? These are the Medicineras. This is the name of my organization, where the women that were using plants as a remedy or as a poison. And when this knowledge of these women that were women going from one place to another, they used to be migrant women, taking care of this knowledge of the community for things that are super important for any kind of society, no? That is things like who has the control about pain, about pleasure, about emotions, no? Then we know that how plants can be used as how the psychoactive plants can be used for this, for the wellness of the people, not just mental health, but also physical health, emotional health, etc. When you give this power from women to doctors or to the pharmacy, um, that they are using the same plants that these women were using 3 centuries ago. The plants have not changed. What have been changed is how have they been used and what is the conception of what that we have around these plants. No, all the societies have been using plants for the well-being, to build communities, etc. These women were using plants for reproductive health, to take care of their pregnancies, to take care of their moods, also for pain, also for pleasure. No, when all this medical and pharmacist knowledge come to take care of all this, they began to think from another perspective, from the men perspective. Who were the pharmacists? Who were the doctors? They were men, high class, that they could read, etc. But they, and also they had a concept of health, of well-being that was more the lack of pain, the lack of illness. It was not anymore about community, about wellness. Also, we have to think about the morals that came behind, no? Pleasures disappear from the picture, no? And also began the stigma against women who use drugs. They were criminalized, they were eroticized, but this knowledge disappeared. And of course, women use drugs. Women produce plants. And it's really different if you are producing these plants in poor communities in the global south, that if you are planting these plants here in the States, for example, no? Women sell drugs. And who are the ones who are selling drugs? Here you have a few pictures. One of them are women that were selling alcohol during Prohibition here. We have, of course, Griselda Blanco, that now you all know who she was, but she was selling, teaching everything that he knows to Pablo Escobar. And also we have here La Paca, that is a Gypsy woman that has had the control of heroin in Mallorca, my island, for a long time. All of them have something in common. They come from pure communities, stigmatizing communities. They were widows, they were alone, they were people from their family in charge, etc. And they find in this market the only way to survive. And they were successful, by the way. And also, we have the women who use drugs. And 80%, 85% of the people who use drugs, also women, don't have problems related with drug use. And I'm not saying that myself, but the World Health Organization. Then who are the women who really has problems related with drug use? When we take the drugs from the equation, we can see what is the reality of the problem of the women who has problems related with drugs. And we saw that 100% of them are survivors of violence. It's overwhelming how they survive violence during childhood, violence during adulthood, not just by their partners, but people they don't know, by their families, by their communities. Also how they are, the violence that comes with all the criminalization of being, and from this intersectional point of view, of being from homeless, living without a roof in your head, doing sex for survival, surviving transphobia, sex work phobia, drug phobia. Also, you can see in this data, that is the one that we can have from the data collected by Medzineras, that around 50% of the women that are coming to Medzineras have migratory experience, 30% are racialized, and then we can see how the racism has an impact here. Yesterday, we were talking with about that the high rates of incarceration of Latin American women impacted by the war on drugs around the world, no? And I'm gonna finish here, but what this has in common, especially, is that these women cannot access to any of the network of support on not the traditional networks of protection for women surviving violence or for mental health issues or for housing because they are using drugs. And if you are using drugs, the stigma doesn't allow you to go there. And also they have a lot of rules, and normally they don't accept people who use drugs, not even women. And also when they go to the harm reduction services or the drug-related services, they are just representing the 15%. Then they are not safe place for them, and all of these develop in a really barriers to access rights, no? But also women have been organizing themselves to answer these situations. And we know that the problems are not the drugs, that we need to put the women in the center and be able to, they have the right to define what are their process of wellness. Doesn't mean that they have to be abstinent, but also they need to be at the center deciding their, what they need, what they want, and what is their way, their path to the wellness. We need to reduce the barriers. We need to make sure that they are part of the process, the design, the implementation, the monitoring and evaluation of all the actions that gonna impact in their lives. And also we need to be sure that we are part of the social movements, including the feminist movement that normally didn't take care of the women that are outside of that. I don't want to put this video, but there are a lot of good practices answering from a feminist intersectional point of view. And yeah, there is no feminist future without ending the war on drugs.
Thank you very much, Aura. You
I'm
can
gonna, yeah, let me
stop
check.
sharing here. Thank you very much, Aura, for this very enlightening presentation. Now I'm gonna take the floor to enter with my presentation or my talk, in which I would like to present to all of you why we need to have a decolonization perspective, and change the narrative to actually develop strategies so the disproportionate impact of women that women get from the war on drugs starts changing, and that comes from shifting powers. In that sense, I like to start this talk by a sentence that a friend of mine who lives in Brazil always tells, and he says, when we say war on drugs, in the north, people think we're talking about drugs. In the south, we're talking about war. And that's very interesting because when we say war on drugs, we think we are talking about a metaphor on how to fight something that is not a living being, how to fight substances. But then when you go to the practical side of it, the war on drugs in many countries, and not only on the south but also on the north, we can see that right now in many countries of Europe and even in here in the United States, the war on drugs is a war on people, and it's a war on people that disproportionately affects people that's been racialized, people who is in poverty, people who is, and especially women that are in vulnerable situations, that are racialized, that are brown, black, indigenous, gypsies communities, Islamic communities, and especially we believe that this disproportionate impact has got a lot to do with the narrative. And that is why it's so important to start thinking about the narrative. The narrative of the drugs, as Aura was mentioning, comes from a perspective in which there is a right and a wrong. And then the fact that the world has criminalized drugs has transferred to criminalizing people and communities. we can see that right now in many parts of the world. But the bad part, or the craziest part about it, is how people tend to believe everyone that that's the correct way to go. So we can see in different communities, in different parts of the world, sentences like, um, a good bandit is a dead bandit, or a good criminal is a dead criminal, for example, something that you hear a lot in Brazil. Or, for example, a president in Colombia, when some innocent youngsters were killed, he said they shouldn't be doing anything correct. So the narrative comes from the perspective that everyone who is in a situation of poverty, of exclusion, it's a criminal. And that is where it supports the idea that everyone that is in the criminal side of life should be therefore killed or put in jail. But the reality that we see is that most of the people who is criminalized is not linked to drugs voluntarily, has been linked to drugs because they are in situations of vulnerability, because they don't have job opportunities, because the capitalist system has pushed them to find any way of finding a living. And then that affects way more women, because we see that women normally are more responsible of finding the money and the means to survive and to give to their families. So many times are women who, in militarized areas or in areas where mafias take control, they are the ones that are forced to sell drugs, to hang on to drugs, and to be part of this chain. But then when they are criminalized and they are put in jail, there is no gender perspective at all. And there is no gender perspective, and there is no not understanding, because we all believe that if they are criminalized because the relationship to drugs, that is right. And that's the calling that I want to bring today here, is we need to start thinking that the drug markets appear for people in rural peripheries, favelas, and poor neighborhoods all over the world. And they appear as an illegal substance that comes with a lot of different strategies to continue surviving in the middle of this criminalization. So it's not something that people access voluntarily, but it's something that has come to the reality of exclusion all over the world. And what has happened is that there is an increasing number of incarcerated women all over the world. 80% of incarcerated women are due to drug related offenses that normally are very small or petty offenses, but they end up in jail. And that situation, Coleta is going to talk a little bit more profoundly about it, starts a cycle of a stigma, a social stigma that makes it very hard to be back into society as a regular woman when you're a formerly incarcerated woman. And especially in rural areas and in militarized areas, even in cities, it's very difficult to get rid of the stigma when you're visibly impoverished, when you're visibly trans, when you are visibly a drug user. So it's very important when we're thinking about the narrative change. It's very important to understand that there is no such thing as right or wrong. There is not such thing as they are criminals because they want. There is no such thing as they have to deal with the consequences of their acts, because the majority, if not the 100% of the times that they have to deal the consequences, is not because they got into it voluntarily, but because of the drug policy worldwide that is generating uh, laws that criminalize and penalize with a very punitive approach communities that are in vulnerable situation, and in peripheries and in rural areas in different parts of the world. So with that, I will give the floor to my to the next. Let me just check here who's coming next. To our next panelist. Oh, so I'm gonna give the floor here to Catherine Cook. Catherine leads Harm Reduction International Sustainable Financing Team. She she has done a very portfolio of groundbreaking research and policy analysis financing for harm reduction, and she will be talking about funding and budgeting. She will be giving some indicators and data about funding for harm reduction. Catherine, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here with you all today. Is that showing the screen, the presentation to everybody?
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so my name's Catherine and I work at Harm Reduction International. Today I'm going to talk about money and data, which I'm going to talk about the vast amounts of money that are being spent on the punitive drug approaches around the world, which particularly impact women, and show how increasing investments in harm reduction, in drug policy reform, and in feminist organizing are all important for gender justice. So on the slide here, you can see some findings from our research that came out last year on the harm reduction funding landscape. And harm reduction is and always has been really, really underfunded. So this is the kind of provision of services to people to protect them from drug-related harms, to protect from potential HIV infection, hepatitis infection, but it's also a kind of first port of call for any kind of support for people who use drugs, and it's a safe space for people. It's crucially important, and it's got backing from UN agencies as being important. Governments have committed to providing money towards harm reduction as part of efforts to end AIDS and eliminate hepatitis. So it's something that should be funded, and it's kind of evidence-backed, and the world agrees that it should be funded. But you can see here that in 2022, there was a 94% funding gap. And there's still a significant reliance on international donors. So the way that we collect this data is through surveys and calls to donors, and looking at what data is out there and what governments are spending. But when we spoke to donors, we asked them about the investments that they had towards programs reaching women who use drugs or gender responsive harm reduction services. And most of the donors said that they did have specific efforts in this area, but a lot of them, pretty much all of them couldn't actually tell us what was being spent. So they couldn't give figures to back this up because they weren't tracking it specifically. So we already know that we need better data to establish what's being spent on women and gender diverse services within harm reduction. But we know anyway that it's very limited and it desperately needs more funding and attention. 1 in 3 women who use drugs, 1 in 3 people who use drugs worldwide are women. And yet harm reduction services are predominantly tailored towards men who use drugs. They rarely respond to women's needs, and they don't include reproductive health care, protection from gender-based violence, any kind of accommodation for childcare and things like this. So there's a real bias towards providing harm reduction towards men other than women. So that data was from last year, and this year we have a very different picture because we have impact from PEPFAR funding cuts, the US government funding cuts that are affecting harm reduction really badly. Clinics have been closed. You can see here the kind of impacts that have been experienced around the world. Service provision, wider services that people were accessing for HIV, hepatitis, TB, supply chain disruptions. Stuck work orders have meant that UN agencies that might have had a focus on harm reduction are also being affected. And really importantly, the backbone of harm reduction around the world is community organizations and community advocacy, pushing for drug law reform, pushing for greater access to services, for quality services. And unfortunately, these are, one of the biggest impacts is that community organizations have been hit hardest, and funding has been stopped for many of those organizations. But then obviously really relevant for the conversation today is the fact that gender responsive harm reduction is at particular risk. And these cuts are coinciding with attacks on gender rights, with the US government talking about diversity, equality, and inclusion language needing to be removed from programs. And the knock-on impact of this is that organizations that are dependent on US funding are removing references to gender equality and women's leadership to remain eligible for funds. And even beyond those that were receiving funds from the US, we're seeing that an emboldening of anti-rights rhetoric that is particularly threatening to services with a gender focus. So here on the screen, you can see in stark contrast, while harm reduction is facing its most profound moment of crisis, governments and donors are spending vast amounts on punitive drug approaches around the world. And for a long time within the harm reduction sector, we've been talking about the need for governments to critically look at this spending and to think about shifting even a small proportion across to harm reduction that would fully fund the harm reduction need around the world if they shifted a small proportion across, and invested in communities, in health and in justice. The evidence base around the global war on drugs and punitive approaches, not only failing to reduce drug use, but also succeeding in perpetuating human rights abuses and impeding public health approaches, is absolutely vast now. There's no, it's unequivocal. You can see here on the screen just a few kind of quotes from reports and studies talking about the war on drugs as being failure, being ideological, counterproductive. As we've heard from speakers already, the war on drugs is a war on people. It's characterized by oppression and rights violations. And women and gender diverse people who use drugs are disproportionately affected. And I'm not going to go into details on the ways that this pans out, but I hope that it's becoming clear that as we're talking about the need to campaign for ending the war on drugs, that is also a campaign for gender justice. So when we were looking closely at international funding flows supporting the war on drugs, we discovered to our surprise that there were aid budgets being used to fund the war on drugs around the world in low and middle income countries, which was, surprising because it seems an unusual choice for budgets that are supposed to be supporting poverty reduction and development goals. And the OECD is the body that determines what spending donors can count as aid. And there was an official category. There is an official category, narcotics control, within that their allowable expenses. And we found that dozens of donors, led by the US and the EU, have used almost 1 billion from their aid budgets for narcotics control activities between 2012 and 2021. And you can see here that in 2021, for example, more aid was spent on narcotics control than on school feeding, on labour rights, on mental health projects, which is surprising. And importantly, some of this narcotics control spending from aid budgets was spent in countries that have the death penalty for drug offences. In 2024, there were 34 countries around the world that retained the death penalty for drug offences, despite this being against international law. And this map shows in the light blue, the recipients of aid for narcotics control, and in the dark blue, you can see those that have death penalty as well. And this really raises concerns around whether aid budgets have been bolstering regimes that execute people. And looking at the data for 2024, at least 18 women were executed for drug offences. That's 14 in Iran, including one woman that was only 16 at the time of her arrest and had experienced forced marriage. 4 women in Saudi Arabia, all foreign nationals. And at least 61 million were on death row in 2024. in countries like Bangladesh, Iraq, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Thailand. So the negative consequences of punitive approaches to drugs on human rights and health have been extensively documented, and the positive impact of progressive drug policies, of providing harm reduction services, and of supporting communities is well documented. So there is an opportunity to correct this balance, to shift funding away from punitive approaches and towards those that are beneficial to communities. So that's what we call for. That's what we want to see. That's what we're asking donors and governments to do. And in the current crisis, we really need to focus as well on advocacy towards governments to put more domestic resources towards harm reduction. They're not going to fund advocacy, likely. They're not going to fund community organizing necessarily, but the service provision, we really need to see more domestic investment in harm reduction. We need to see more improvements in the financial data monitoring by donors and governments, because we need that for transparency. We need it for accountability. And we don't think there's any place in aid for narcotics control. It shouldn't be an allowable expense for aid budgets. And lastly, but really importantly, feminist donors should really be considering drug policy reform and harm reduction within their portfolios, because ending the war on drugs and providing services to women and gender diverse people who use drugs is an essential part of gendered justice. And I'll leave it there. But if you want to read more about the studies that I've mentioned, you can use this QR code or these URLs to get to those reports. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's very enlightening to see this data, and to thank you very much not only for your presentation but for the report. I think it's very important to understand how the huge and the big difference between how much we invest in narcotics control and how less is invested in really actually addressing the problem. And I think there are a lot of decisions made there that we need to rethink, and that's the call. So thank you very much. Now I want to give the floor to our next panelist, Ruth Virgin. Ruth has been working for over 30 years in drug users organizing and harm reduction, with a particular focus on gender responsive programming. She is currently affiliated with the Women Harm Reduction International Network, and she would be presenting defending gender responsive harm reduction programming here in this panel. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Ruth.
Thank you very much. My pronouns are she or her. And in declaring pronouns, of course, we all have an indispensable way to push back on the anti-gender rights mania afoot. RIN is led by women and gender expansive people who use drugs, and we work to advance community-led, gender responsive harm reduction services globally through various streams of work. This includes, justice and ending violence campaigns, partnering with CEDAW for shadow report, with country level partners for shadow reporting, and sexual and reproductive health rights workshops to integrate sexual and reproductive health with harm reduction services for women and gender diverse people who use drugs. Gender responsive harm reduction programs are often the only services where they exist that can effectively connect women who use drugs and gender diverse people who use drugs, again, where these services exist, to essential health and social services. Thanks so much to my colleagues for setting the stage here for what I have to say. So it makes it much easier. So much more urgently needs to be done. But looking back, there's also been so much progress. When I think about when RIN, our network, was founded back in 2009, we had thought these incremental advances represented an unstoppable progressive trajectory towards gender rights and human dignity for communities of people who use drugs and for society as a whole. Now, and as we field accounts from our allies around the world of the impact of these brutal AIDS slashes, we see that these collective and hard-won gains were not the unstoppable force that they deserve to be. But we have to, and we will keep going. So in that vein, I want to share with all of you a short statement that we prepared for International Women's Day just 10 days ago, endorsed by, I think, all of the sonic organizations represented virtual and live on this panel, along with many others, including AWID, the International Community of Women Living with HIV, Medicine du Monde, as well as so many fabulous grassroots allies. Recent retrograde shifts in foreign aid and diminishing civil society space threaten gains made through decades of evidence-based harm reduction programming that have saved countless lives globally. Civil society organizations providing crucial peer support systems are now being defunded and their voices repressed. Concurrently, feminism and LGBTQI plus rights and sexual and reproductive health services, including contraception, gender-based violence services, and safe abortion, are being assaulted. Now, more than ever, harm reduction and underserved populations are at risk as essential life-saving services are being closed down. With the expansion of the measurably harmful global gag rule, sexual and gender diversity are being actively attacked, with trans rights violated to the point of erasure of identity, sexual and reproductive health rights invalidated, and gender equity goals undermined. Funding strangleholds are constraining life-saving healthcare for trans people, women living with HIV, people who use drugs, and other key populations. This spurious attempt to institutionalize patriarchal heteronormative hierarchy serves to sanction and popularize racism, sexism, usophobia, transphobia, homophobia, and xenophobia. Patterns are emerging where, under the guise of family values, ideology literally trumps science, propelling a climate ripe for social destabilization, hate crime, and public health dismemberment. We, the 104 endorsing organizations that supported this statement, stand in solidarity with our gender expansive and cis sisters who use drugs to denounce the current undermining of public health, science, and bodily autonomy, which represent a wider offensive against equality norms, rights protections, and common sense. We recognize that the hard-won progress on gender-responsive harm reduction is under threat. As part of the feminist movement, we are also cognizant of the necessary collective peril that we pose to patriarchy, and that this new attempt at reinstalling sexist oppression and derailing public health must be rapidly reversed. This is a call to action for governments, courts, donors, and as possible for all of you, for all of us, for immediate reopening of opioid agonist therapy clinics, methadone clinics, recognizing their life-saving impact, including for pregnant women who are opioid dependent. We call for laws and policies that safeguard the rights of women and gender-expansive people who use drugs and key populations in access to harm reduction and other healthcare, including gender-affirming care, without discrimination and criminalization. We call for direct, flexible, sustained, and safeguarded funding for women and gender-expansive people, people-led harm reduction organizations and networks of people who use drugs. We stand in solidarity with the harm reduction and feminist movements, excuse me, and communities worldwide as the aid frees forces life-saving programs to shut down. Harm reduction is essential and a basic human right. These decisions are negligent, unjust, already costing lives, and must be immediately revoked. We stand ready to continue our work to address systemic barriers to health and rights for women and gender expansive people who use drugs. And thus ends the statement. We always have, and always will find ways to do this work and support each other no matter what. And so with indignant yet joyful resistance, let's work together to fight back and sustain our movements to preserve human rights and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Very important talk, and thank you for reading the statement. We all really stand in solidarity, and also we all need to address this very difficult counterback and what's going on with the rise of different powers in the world, that it's a little bit scary. So thank you so much for bringing our attention to this issue. And now I want to give the floor to Elisa Kursevic, Program Manager at Eurasian Harm Reduction Association. And Elisa is gonna talk about gender responsive harm reduction with a special focus on gender-based violence. Thank you so much, Elisa, for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sylvie. Thank you very much for everyone who joined us today. So my pronouns is she, her. And today I want to address a critical yet often overlooked issue, the intersection of gender-based violence and harm reduction for women who use drugs, and particularly focusing in the Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia region where myself and my organization is working in. This is not just a health or policy issue, it is also a feminist issue. Why we as the women, as a feminist, should care on this topic? So first of all, women who use drugs face systemic gender-based oppression. Feminism at its core is about dismantling systems of oppression that disproportionately harm women. Women who use drugs are at the crossroads, multiple forms of discrimination because of their gender, their use, their socioeconomic status, and often their experiences of violence. This is a structural violence.
Excuse me, I think there is some issue with your microphone, so I think you're gonna, or your internet, so you're gonna think to speak a little bit more slowly, so I think the streaming gets better your voice, because it's kind of cutting.
Okay, thank you so much. I will try to do it slower. So yeah, just coming back to my thoughts. So this is the structural violence, and if feminists do not stand with women who use drugs, we risk reinforcing a hierarchy where only some women are deemed worthy of support. Secondly, why should other women and feminists care? Is because gender-based violence is widespread in our community. Women who use drugs face extreme levels of violence from intimate partners, from police, healthcare providers, and society at large. Our drug use is often framed as moral failure than a health issue, making us easy targets for abuse without public outreach. The feminist movement has long fought for the right of women to live free from violence, and this must include all women, including those who use drugs. Thirdly, the war on drugs is a war on women. Prohibition and punitive drug laws disproportionately harm us, women, by exposing us to the incarceration, loss of parental rights, and denial of health care. Feminists should advocate policies that do not criminalize survival strategies such as sex work or self-medication, but rather provide support, safety, and autonomy. Also, feminism is about bodily autonomy and choice. The feminist movement has always fought for bodily autonomy, whether in reproductive rights, sexual freedom, or the right to say no to violence. And women who use drugs are often denied agency over our own bodies. Uh, we are forced into treatment, forced in sterilization, punished for making choices about our own health and substance use. And if feminists stand for bodily autonomy, this must extend also to women who use drugs as well. Coming back and just give a little background about the region where I'm working in, about Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia region. Women who use drugs in my region face high rates of disability, yet they are less likely than other women to receive help. Many fear arrests, losing their children, being denied medical care. Some of the key challenges which we face include violence from partners and police. Many women report being raped or assaulted by law enforcement, but fear reporting these crimes due to retaliation or arrests. Also, barriers to support services. So domestic violence shelters often exclude women who use drugs from their support. Harm reduction centers, on the other hand, are usually male dominated and sometimes even unsafe spaces for women who use drugs. Punitive drug laws, many women stay in abusive relationships because they rely on a partner for access to drugs or even harm reduction services in some cases. There is also a fear of losing custody of their children, also prevents them from seeking the help. So what can we do? Uh, we cannot claim to fight for gender justice while ignoring one of the most marginalized groups of women. Our response to gender-based violence and harm reduction must include, first of all, an advocacy for the decriminalization. Feminists have a long history of fighting for reproductive rights and against carceral feminism. We must now push for criminalizing drug use to reduce the harm and stigma that keep women trapped in cycles of violence. Secondly, creating safe spaces. Harm reduction services must be gender responsive, more women-only spaces, peer-led support groups, and trauma-informed care can make a tangible difference. Also challenging stigma, so feminists have successfully fought to shift the narratives around domestic violence and sexual assault. We must now challenge the stigma around women who use drugs, ensuring we are seen as deserving rights, protection, and care, and amplifying voices of women who use drugs, nothing about us without us. Feminist movements should work alongside women who use drugs, ensuring our experiences, needs, and solutions are central to advocacy efforts. And just to conclude, I want to say that feminism is about justice, inclusion, and fighting for all women, not just those who fit into the society's idea of respectability. If we are serious about ending gender-based violence, we also must be serious about harm reduction, about policy reform, and defending the rights of women who use drugs. This is a feminism issue, and we must act like it. Thank you so much. We'll be happy to answer any questions if there will be any.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for being here from the Eurasia. That's a territory that, for a lot of us that are in the side of the Americas, is very far away. So it's a reality very hard to know. So thank you very much for bringing that perspective. That it's very important. And now I would like to give the floor to Coleta Jongers. Coleta is a senior fellow at the Washington Office of Latin America, WALA. She is a founding member of the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women, and she would be talking about feminism, drug policy, and criminalization of women. Thank you, Coletta, for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me, and I really want to thank Metzanares for bringing this great panel together and spotlighting this issue here at the CSW. And I'd also just like to give a shout out to Eliza for that great summary of why the issues we are talking about should be on the feminist agenda. My pronouns are she, her. And basically, I'm going to talk about three issues in the short time allotted to me. First, the dramatic increase in women's incarceration around the world, why feminists should care about this issue, and how formerly incarcerated women are now organizing and demanding a seat at the table in these discussions. And I'd just like to say that in our work on women, drug policy, and incarceration, when referring to women, we include all of those who identify women, obviously including trans women, or as gender diverse. So as Sylvie said in her remarks, women's incarceration globally is growing at alarming rates and at a much faster rate than that of men. According to the World Female Imprisonment List, since 2000, the detention of women and girls around the world has increased by 60%, whereby that of men rose by about 22%. And one of the most important driving factors in women's incarceration around the world is punitive drug policies. The proportion of women in prison sentenced for drug-related offenses is higher than that of men, making up 35% of the global female prison population compared to 19% of men. In other words, punitive drug policies disproportionately impact women. In Latin America, for example, our research shows that anywhere from, obviously depending on the country, 20, 25, 30% of men are incarcerated for reasons related to drugs, whereas in the case of women, it tends to be 40 to 60 or even as high as 80% of the female prison population. In some Latin American and Asian countries, as much as 80% of incarcerated women are behind bars for drug-related reasons. And let's keep in mind that we are not talking about people who are in the upper echelons of criminal organizations. On the contrary, these women are in prison for low-level activities, carrying or buying drugs for their personal use, small-scale trafficking, or small-scale dealing, rather, or transporting drugs within a country or across borders. For this, they tend to receive very little money, and their incarceration makes no difference in the drug trade in the end because they are very easily replaced once they are put behind bars. So why should feminists care? Eliza already gave a very good explanation to this, but I'd like to just add a few points related to women in prison. So, as I said, draconian drug laws, along with lack of economic opportunity, domestic and sexual violence, and racial and gender discrimination are the primary root causes of women's criminalization and incarceration, all issues that should be on the feminist agenda. While more men are clearly in prison worldwide than women, incarceration has a disproportionate impact on women with devastating impacts on their children and families. And we need to keep in mind that in at least the countries that we've studied in Latin America, most women in prison are sole heads of households. So when they are put behind bars, this has obviously devastating impacts on their children and can lead to cycles of poverty. Women are confined in prisons designed for men and do not have access to adequate gender-sensitive health care. They don't have access to menstrual products or other reproductive health care. And I would just like to note that one thing that's not often talked about in these discussions, but in countries like the United States, where women tend to go to prison well in the age of their 20s, and sentenced to excessively long years, by the time they've come out of prison, they are no longer able to have had children if they wanted to have children. So far too many, and women obviously do not have access to to harm reduction services while in prison. So far too many women leave prison with serious mental and physical health problems. Studies show that most women in prison were subject to sexual violence, including domestic violence, before coming into contact with the law, during their detention, and while in prison. Women behind bars face multiple forms of physical and sexual violence, including rape. Trans women and those who are gender diverse are particularly at risk. I've heard so many heartbreaking stories of what women have had to suffer while being in prison. Racial disparities are well documented. And upon their release, women face even greater stigma and discrimination than that faced by men involved in criminal legal systems, as they are seen as having defied the stereotypical roles of caregivers and mothers that the society has bestowed upon them. And finally, with criminal records, they have tremendous difficulty accessing housing, services, and particularly employment that pays a living wage. Many women end up in the informal sector where they are just able to scrape by enough money to put food on the table for their kids, or they end up in jobs where they're getting salaries below the minimum wage. And of course, because of their situation, they are subject to abuse and including sexual abuse and violence by their employers. And I just want to give a shout out to a new report titled From Poverty to Punishment that was released at the CSW yesterday by Penal Reform International and Women Beyond Walls, which shows the pathways from situations of poverty to landing in a prison cell. So finally, I want to talk about the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women. In response to this situation, formerly incarcerated women from around the world have come together in the first international network of formerly incarcerated women. The network brings together hundreds of women from about 25 countries on 6 continents. And it was really only founded in the last few years, and it has come together remarkably quickly. It's founded and led by directly impacted women. It was created in response to the alarming increase in women's incarceration globally and the devastating harms caused by incarceration on women and their children, families, and communities, the issues that we've been talking about here. And the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women seeks to change the prevailing paradigm from punishment to transformative justice and to end the incarceration of women and girls around the world. We envision a world where all women and children live with dignity and full respect for their human rights. To conclude, I just want to point out that formerly incarcerated women have been largely absent in feminist spaces. This is slowly starting to change, very slowly. The International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women was active at the AWED Feminist Forum in Bangkok last December. Several members of the network have spoken at CSW side events this year, but much more needs to be done to ensure that those most directly impacted by punitive policies are at the center of these discussions. And most importantly, we must resist carceral feminism. I'm going to stop it there and turn it over to Anne to wrap up the formal presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Coletta, for bringing this perspective. It was very interesting yesterday, the presentation of the report from poverty to criminalization, because we had the chance to listen also the lived experience from different incarcerated women, formerly incarcerated women that had to go through all the criminal penal system. And really, it's an issue that we need to start paying a lot of more attention as feminists. And it's also very shocking, the relationship between drugs and criminalization. So that brings to the point which just adds more to why drug policy, it's a feminist issue and should be taken into consideration as a feminist issue. And so thank you very much for your talk. I want to give the floor now to Anne Fordham. Anne is executive director at International Drug Policy Consortium, and we just met at CND, where IDPC, led by Anne, did an amazing job on getting together all the civil society and networking and working towards the same objective. So thank you very much for, after such a hard work, being also here today. And it's gonna talk about how change right now, it's an opportunity. The floor is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sylvie. Really thanks to you and Aura and Metzeneres for bringing us all together for this very timely and critical conversation. Taking a feminist approach to drug policy is so critical right now because we are at a very, frightening political inflection point, both globally, and locally where multiple crises are intersecting. Across the world, we see a terrifying backlash against movements for racial justice, for gender equality, for bodily autonomy, and in fact, for basic human rights. And the US administration is at the heart of this, fueling this by pushing authoritarianism, racism, misogyny, and carceral politics. Not to mention, as we've heard earlier from Catherine Cook, dismantling the global health and humanitarian infrastructure overnight. So I fear that we also can see or can expect to see a parallel reboot of the long-led US war on drugs. It fits well, unfortunately, with the political thrust of this moment. Repressive drug control has been a tool to criminalize Black, Brown, Indigenous people, as well as women and other LGBTQ people the world over, as we have already heard from colleagues on the panel today. It has been a very convenient tool of the state to police borders and to expand prisons, to justify surveillance and militarized policing, and of course to justify military intervention in third countries, particularly countries deemed to be producer countries when it comes to the drug market. So this is why, more than ever, we need a feminist approach to drug policy, because it isn't about just reforming a failed system, about drug, where drug control has failed, but it's about resisting a much bigger structural machinery of control that we see the increasingly growing far right will probably seek to strengthen. So I want to make just a few points to close out the panel as to why it's so urgent at this moment and the opportunity that we are afforded now, both as feminists and drug policy advocates, to think about drug policy really from a feminist lens. And of course, some of the points have already been made, so I will be, repeating and summarizing what some colleagues have already mentioned. But firstly, the war on drugs has deepened gendered and racialized harm. Despite decades of evidence that drug policies don't reduce use or the scale of the drug market, many governments continue to double down on criminalization, which targets the most marginalized in societies, including poor women, Black, Indigenous communities, and LGBT people. As Coletta mentioned just now, women are the fastest growing prison population globally, often incarcerated for nonviolent, low-level offenses. These women are, not at the top of the food chain. They're not the cartel bosses. They're single mothers. They're survivors of violence, or they're women simply trying to survive poverty. And they're, women are often also punished for drugs while using punished for using drugs while pregnant. They're denied housing, employment, and healthcare. They're labeled as unfit mothers. Their children are removed from them, and they're really treated as criminals instead of people with needs who have dignity. And as now with in power again, the same dangerous rhetoric as before, tougher drug laws, more police, more prisons. His administration has even discussed previously and again the idea of reinstating the death penalty for drug offenses. They have attacked harm reduction programs. They have expanded border enforcement in the name of fighting fentanyl, not to mention the tariffs that have been implemented, of course. And these policies aren't about safety. They're about consolidating power and punishing poor people. So a feminist approach reframes drug use and involvement in drug economies not as moral failings, but as consequences of structural violence. Secondly, global drug policy reforms actually risk repeating inequities if we don't take a feminist approach to those. So although it's not all doom and gloom, and there have been growing reforms around the world on drug policy, even as we fight this reactionary wave, we have to be honest and say that progressive drug policy reforms often have not gone far enough and have left some of the most marginalized behind. So we do see a trend towards more decriminalization and also legal regulation. But there's a risk that these reforms reinforce existing power structures if they don't center equity. Without a feminist lens, reforms can exclude women from economic opportunities. It can fail to expunge criminal records and overlook the social and health needs of marginalized groups. It also can erase the people who may have paid the highest price under prohibition and fail to repair the harm. So a feminist approach insists that drug policy reform must be intersectional and reparative. That means that criminal records must be expunged. We should be decriminalizing all drugs, not just, cannabis or psychedelics. We need to defund punitive systems and fund housing, healthcare, and harm reduction. And we must invest in the communities most impacted by the drug war. And for legal regulation, this requires us to understand that these markets already do exist and that we need to bring the actors that have been operating in illegal markets into legal markets as they open up, ensuring a just transition so that the traditional actors, such as, say, subsistence farmers, can participate in growing legal markets. And we see this especially for cannabis. Thirdly, feminist policy, I think, as we all know, is not just about women. It's about structural transformation, right? It's about shifting the focus from substances to systems, to poverty, to criminalization, to colonization, and to gender-based oppression. And it recognizes that drug policies are not neutral, but they're instruments of social control that have targeted, racialized, and gendered people. So a feminist approach aligns with wider movements for racial justice, for housing, for reproductive justice, for bodily autonomy and disability rights. And it makes it a powerful tool for our work to work with other movements for intersectional policy change and solidarity, which has never been more urgent than in this moment. My fourth and final point is that this crisis moment forces us to rethink and to reimagine. When we talk about the serious crisis for harm reduction, which has obviously been growing for decades, really, but has really been exacerbated by the US government's withdrawal of development assistance and the breaking apart of USAID, we need to start thinking more broadly about true global economic justice. If we take the lessons of feminism and take a structural approach to this too, we see the limitations of development aid, that it was actually a tool for geopolitical control used by post-colonial powers to preserve rather than eliminate global inequity and inequality. So when we do call for domestic financing for harm reduction programs, that is what needed, and other health programs now defunded by the US and other donors, we also need to be calling for debt justice. So just one example, in one country that has been most drastically impacted by USAID's withdrawal is South Africa, where the debt to GDP ratio has skyrocketed from around 23% in 2008 to around 75% today, making debt servicing very high on their national budgets and creating huge pressure for the government to be able to take up domestic financing. A feminist drug policy calls on us to understand all the systems of oppression that drive harm, from punitive drug policies, the carceral state, and more broadly, economic justice. That's why it's so critical at this time to take a feminist approach to our work and to reach out to more feminists to join us. We are living in a moment of deep political uncertainty and rising political danger. But the future is not written. Nothing is inevitable, and we are not powerless. So let's build a drug policy and a world that's rooted in healing, dignity, and liberation for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, for your conclusions and bringing together all this data and information that it's very important to open up the debate and the question and answer session because what you said, it cannot be more true that we are not powerless. We are here and we are willing to take action to stop this very critical withdrawal and to understand and to try to find ways to understand how can we keep working in a more justice world, in a world that takes into consideration the disproportionate impacts and in order for us to build together drug policies and feminist policies and health policies that can address the most complex issues that are affecting women all over the world. And when I say women, as Coletta say, we believe we include gender responsive people in this way of referring to women as they recognize themselves as women. So I would like to open up questions. If anyone has opinions or questions, please raise your hand or just write it on the chat, or just put it on the chat or raise your hand. We would love to listen to all of you, not only questions, but also remarks, opinions. How do you see this perspective? Why drug policy should be understood also and should be taken into consideration as a feminist issue? Let me see if we see, si vemos a todo el mundo, puedes poner el... Ahí vista, a la derecha, a la derecha.
No, es que está todo el mundo están con las cámaras apagadas. Un segundo.
Espera un segundo.
And I was really interested in your analysis of the discussion, and particularly your focus on the economic justice that seems to be the drive behind a lot of the egregious propaganda that we're collectively experiencing. And thank you very much for doing that. And maybe while we're waiting for questions from others, if there was anything else you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. That actually came from, and I think we were all going through that, a moment of deep grief and despair that I was suffering a few weeks ago. We all were, probably the valley of despair, I think it is on the grief curve. Just, so desperate in terms of looking at the HIV response, for example, crumble overnight, and for me, I've been working 2 decades in HIV, and it was just devastating to think about all the people who wouldn't have access to treatment, or the fact that HIV prevention would now be decimated in so many parts of the world. And it was actually talking to a feminist friend who really asked me to think about this in broader terms, and really shone a light on the fact that this is the moment where the opportunity is to call for true global economic justice, and to understand that development assistance has actually been, a colonial project from the start, and that we cannot just be satisfied with, what development assistance was providing. Of course, it's saved millions and millions of lives, and that is not something to be denied, but that what the future would look like if, there was true debt forgiveness, for example, and that it would allow these states, these countries that have been so dependent on an organization like USAID, that wouldn't have to service such high levels of debt or debt at all, to be able to fund their own responses. And it was a real eye-opening conversation for me, and I think helped me to slowly pull myself out of the valley of despair as well, which I think was helpful. So it maybe helps us to, I think that's why feminism has been helpful for us working in drug policy, to take this broader approach to understand state violence and structural oppression in its broadest sense, and then to figure out how we resist and fight back. But I'd love to know what others think about that, or any other thoughts people have.
I just thought to mention, because yesterday was also mentioned, the big shift that happened at CND um, last week in terms of the commission passing the resolution on revising and rethinking the whole structure of drug policy. And I think that's a very interesting, and it gives us, some space, as you were mentioning, and how we're not, we're not powerless. We can do things, and this opens a path. And yesterday, the ambassador of Colombia to gender to the UN, Arlene Tegner, also mentioned the public utility law that has been in Colombia for the past year, which has a lot of things to improve. But it's one example, like the resolution at CND, not only the Colombia resolution, but also the one with focus on the environment passed, also sponsored by Brazil, and the public utility law in Colombia are, for me, are like pockets of resistance that can like show us ways to keep working and to understand that there is a possibility, that in the middle or in the midst of this falling apart reality or very dystopic reality, those things are still happening. And I think those things are happening because even though global aid and development has not been one of the most nurturing scenarios, the civil society worldwide has been, for the past 2 decades, have been growing and being more powerful every year. Not in terms because not because of the funding, but because of the will of the power and of the of each person who makes part of this civil society. That I believe we are a group of tireless working people towards this. What we believe is hope, or what we believe is a global desire. So I think I would also focus on our power and our strength, and to not lose hope in these very chaotic and dark coming days. Coleta?
Well, first of all, thank you for focusing on opportunities and hope. As somebody living in the United States, and particularly in Washington, D.C., it's hard not to get lost in the despair every day. But just two quick things. One is I really want to thank Anne for her comments about economic justice. I have said to many people in recent days that I've really annoyed and angry that I find myself defending USAID, because we know that they have done some very good programs and with regards to the channeling of funds to PEPFAR and with regards to public health. But we have to remember that USAID was created to advance U.S. interests abroad, and it has done more to support U.S. farmers and U.S. businesses than in many ways, to support folks on the ground. And so many of the programs do come from a very clear political perspective. I say that as a titulo personal, as my own person, and not necessarily representing the organization for which I am a senior fellow. But I thought that was really helpful. And I just wanted to say a little bit more about the public utility law that Sylvie referred to, because I just came from Colombia, got back yesterday. That is a law that basically allows for women who meet certain conditions, primarily women heads of households who were in situations of vulnerability when detained, to do community service instead of going to prison. It has been slow rolling out. As of yesterday, when there was an article in the paper about it in Colombia, on Sunday, 134 women have benefited, which is definitely moving in the right direction. And interestingly, of that 134, 93 were convicted of drug offenses. So this is clearly a measure that is benefiting women convicted of low-level drug transgressions in Colombia. And I was with the group Corporación Mujeres Libres, led by Claudia Cardona, who's spoken at least once, if not twice, here at the CSW. They have done an organization of formerly incarcerated women that has done an amazing job of pushing for this law to be passed, helping to develop the implementing regulations for it, and have gone around the country into women's prisons, doing workshops to teach women about the law and how they, what they need to do if they can apply. And Claudia and Jenny and Ale, the women that I was with over the weekend, told me really heartwarming stories of women who were able to stay with their families, women with small children who were able to benefit from this law. The problem, of course, is the law doesn't really provide any kind of means for social reintegration in terms of eliminating criminal records, providing economic support. Women are working for free. Hopefully getting some good work experience, but it is definitely a step in the right direction and a bright spot in an otherwise bleak picture of increasing women's incarceration in Latin America and around the world. But again, let's focus on the positive, and thank you for those comments.
Just to point something positive is this movement, and I think that has been really important to build together this campaign, talking about why drug policy is a feminist issue. It has been important for the feminist movement, I think, because we need to be visible there, but also has been really important for us, no? As if you see all these faces here, we have been leading drug policy for a while as a woman, but also we are working in an environment that is really male focused. Still, we are really invisible in the struggles. We really need to fight for a feminist perspective inside our own movements around drug policy reform. And also we need to fight for drug policy reform inside the feminist movements. Then I think that these kind of campaigns are super important to build these bridges. And I would love also to invite all the collectives and women and gender responsive people that want to join this campaign, just write us and we will be super happy to engage you with the next steps. And yeah, and I think that the next one gonna be in Bogota.
Yeah.
Then
We hope to be able to open up more spaces like this in Bogota and in different conferences. We strongly believe that we need to really bring this issue, as we were mentioning in different meetings at CND. Drug policy affects many of the SDGs. Just to put in that perspective, a life with the right to have a peaceful living is impacted by the drug policy. Environment is impacted by the drug policy. Gender bridge is impacted by drug policy. So we need to be taking this in all these spaces because it's really an issue, and it's very important to see through the perspective of intersectional feminism, which is bringing into consideration all the different vectors of oppression and vulnerability that women are having to cross every day widely. And just a point, we're coming to an end, but just a point that I wanted to mention about the public utility law, because is that Catalonia, as in many other drug related and criminalization related issues, is ahead. And something like the public utility law already exists, and Medicineras, with the rights hub that we have been able to get Medicineras to be a place for community work, to exchange for measures. It's like alternative measures to prison, and that community work can be developed and done in Medicineras as a community center, which I think it's a very interesting example on how, because in many situations there is not such a and it's the place where the community work is going to be done doesn't fit the needs, or doesn't fit what the what it doesn't fit the women, doesn't fit the woman who needs to do them, because it's far away, because they find violence, also because they find stigma. So one of the very interesting things that Medcinera has been able to do is to actually get those alternative measures to happen at Medicineras itself. So it's just
Because what happened was like that the women cannot do, the women who use drugs cannot access to alternative measures, not because they don't have the right to do it, because they don't have programs that fit on them. And they are asking for the women to stay abstinent of drugs. And this was one of the huge barriers for women who were using drugs to access to alternative to imprisonment, because it's linked to absence. Then also, when we are talking about alternative to prison, we need to make sure that these alternatives fits on the needs of the women, and they are not high maintenance programs. Because what happened here is that women had the right, but they didn't have programs to go. It was super crucial to build this bridge.
And I think I wanted to bring that as an example, because that's what we understand as a feminist perspective, when it's not only the ruling, but how it's also when you develop the ruling, and when you put it in practice, how there is a perspective that really helps women and understand their needs, and not just dead letter, as we say in Spanish, that it stays there, and then women cannot actually access them, because all these barriers that normally, if we don't take a feminist perspective, are very hard to see. So, well, I don't know if any of you have another. Yeah, I would just like each of you to have a very final call, or a conclusion, so we can close this beautiful, gorgeous panel with words from each of you. You want to start, Elisa?
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I guess, yeah, as I said in the end of my presentation, feminism is about justice, inclusion, fighting for human rights of women who use drugs. Yeah, we definitely should continue this work with as many allies as possible. So not just focusing specifically on our drug policy or like human rights movement, but just going outside of our own bubble. And that's why, if there are still people listening to us, or maybe somebody will be listening later to the recording, not from our movements, and would like to join us, as Sylvia already said, we are so happy to have you joining us, and to continuing and broadening our discussions on the drug policy as a feminism issue. Thank you very much for joining us. Yeah.
Thanks, Elisa. Ruth?
Yeah, look, like scratching around for a silver lining in all of this chaos. I think the genesis has to be, from the phoenix rises, the ashes of a world where the feminist movement joins with an intersectional perspective, understanding different forms of oppression, including those that have affected people oppressed by this very failed war on people who use drugs, and that we rise together from this into a new world of decolonized equity.
Thank you very much. Catherine?
Thanks. Thank you to everybody for organising this panel and for having this amazing discussion today. I think that, all of us coming together and talking about feminism and drug policy and harm reduction, it's got to continue. It's so important that we continue building a movement that goes beyond our bubble and brings a bigger collective along with it. I encourage everybody to also be constantly questioning where the money's going, because I think that, you know, we talk about budgets as value statements, and I think that we can see exactly what's valued and what isn't valued, and we need to be challenging that all the time. And I just want to say that, you know, I'm really excited for the harm reduction conference that's happening in Bogota next month, where I hope we're going to continue this kind of conversation. And I'm sure we're going to welcome a lot of people from different intersectional movements as well, because we're getting better at that every time we have a conference. So let's continue this conversation there.
Thanks, Catherine. Coletta?
Thanks again to Ara and Sylvie for bringing this terrific discussion together. I think it underscores the fundamental need to reimagine our communities, to reimagine what economic and transformative justice looks like, and to work together to end the incarceration of women and girls around the world. And just one final note, we will have a very small delegation of the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women at the Harm Reduction International Conference, including our newly hired international organizer, Tony Tulloch from Jamaica. So I will be reaching out to folks about connecting you with the folks from the International Network who will be there. And if anybody else would like to meet with that delegation, please let me know. We look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you.
Thank you, Coletta. Anne?
Yeah, thank you again for organizing this session and for bringing us together. You know, I was just reflecting on the fact that we kind of started this conversation pre the latest crisis fueled by the US government, of course, both in terms of funding and in terms of narratives. And, you know, what is happening makes our work even more urgent, I think, and especially around the pieces of solidarity and intersectionality, you know, with other social movements that we're all aligned and moving in the same direction. And yeah, and I think also that the worlds of drug policy reform and feminism are not particularly, you know, far apart. Like we're much closer than we think we are. And when we start to take up that analysis, I think we have so much in common. And in fact, you know, we can already perhaps count ourselves as part of the feminist movement too, in as much as we want them to also take up the drug policy reform message.
Thank you, Anne. Aura?
Thank you. Oh,
Do you want to?
I already did.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was amazing.
Thank you very
to be
much
with
to
you
all of you. Thank you
Really,
very much
really.
for everyone who was in the Huva app and in the Zoom meeting. Thank you very much for being here, and we hope to see you soon and keep building a better world for all women and girls all over the world.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
You. Bye.